Well, if you've just joined us, clearly we're doing the book of Jonah, and we're up to the third major scene of the book, chapter 3. Jonah eventually going to Nineveh. What I want to do just before we dive into this chapter, into chapter 3, and look at it in some detail, I just want you to see the forest from the trees. The book of Jonah is a fairly short book. It's only 48 verses. And the whole major punchline, the whole climactic message of the book really punches through, comes through at the end of the book, chapter 4. So we haven't got there yet. The whole book has been building to chapter 4. That's not to say that the main punchline, the main theme of the book hasn't been poking its head through the verses and chapters that we've been looking so far. But there's three major scenes in the book that are actually all deliberately written in such a way to show us something in chapter 4. It's all building, just like a movie producer would produce the film so that certain scenes fall in such a way that when you get to the climactic ending, it all makes sense. If you moved the last scene to the beginning, it wouldn't make sense, or you wouldn't feel those emotions, or you wouldn't have that lesson, or whatever the film was about, you wouldn't get it until you had sort of scene A, B and C before you get to scene D. This is kind of like how we tell a joke, isn't it? You tell the story of one figure, an Englishman, then a Scotsman, and then an Irishman or an Australian at the end. And you build some certain things within the story so that when you get to the end, it's funny, or in this case, there's this punchy, poignant ending to the book. And Jonah's working like that. The big climb. Now, the trouble is that most of us kind of know what happens in chapter 4, so we're a little lazy on what's going on in the first 3 chapters. But the first 3 chapters are written in such a way to build up and really have this punch in the nose effect in chapter 4. And that means that the author, divinely inspired by God, is writing in such a way not to just narrate the story, the history of what happened, whether you take it historically or as just an Old Testament parable. Leaving that aside, leaving that debate aside, you've got to think about how the narrator is narrating the story. And he's deliberately narrated 3 scenes. We're looking at the third of those scenes before we get to chapter 4, the final scene. In scene 1, which is chapter 1, God tells Jonah to go to the great city of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, the capital of the enemy of Israel, the enemy of Jonah's people, the equivalent of asking a rabbi in the 1930s to go to Berlin and preach to the Nazis there. Jonah, we're told, runs from the presence of the Lord, but the author already is using a narrative tool here. He doesn't tell us why Jonah didn't go to Nineveh. We can presume a few things, but he actually doesn't tell us why Jonah ran deliberately. All we're told at the beginning of the story is Jonah ran from the presence of the Lord. And then he goes down to Joppa. And we would miss the significance of that in the 21st century. But Joppa, of course, is not just a fishing village, a port, a place of commerce. It's really the gateway to the rest of the known world. So in the ancients of Jonah's day, it's like saying Jonah went to Heathrow. Not to get on a plane, obviously, in those days, but to get on the ancient equivalent, a ship. And where's he going to go? Tarshish, where we think most likely is southwest Spain. That's kind of the ends of to get on an EasyJet flight, a BA flight, well, in those days a ship, to take him to the furthest ends of the earth, to run in the opposite way. The author is telling us that this man is getting as far away from the presence of God as possible. All of this is told in such a way to build us up to chapter 4. Jonah running, being the disobedient prophet. And then God sending a storm, a life-threatening storm. The author desperately wants us to know that the storm is life-threatening. Not just any storm, and that it came about by supernatural means. God sent this storm. And everyone's frightened, and ironically Jonah's asleep on the ship. There's a distinction between the sailors who are awake crying out and Jonah asleep. All of this is a narrative ploy. Again, building through the story, but it's going to help us understand the message at the end. And then they wake Jonah, he comes up on deck, and Jonah basically confesses that the storm has come because of his disobedience. He knows the God that made everything, the land and the sea. And the only way to subdue the storm is to throw him over. And here you've got an insight already into the way God saves. Jonah's own life is being used as an illustration to the person of Jesus. Sacrifice this one man and the whole sea will become calm and the sailors will be saved. And this particular man, this Jonah, will descend beneath the waves, pictorially, symbolically, for 3 days and 3 nights under the sea. And Jesus himself draws the parallel to his own death in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. So all of it's narrated and told in such a way, not just that it happened in such a way, which it did, but told in such a way to give us a lesson. That was scene 1. Oh, and at the end of scene 1, you get the fish. God appointing this biological submarine to swallow Jonah. God saving Jonah at the end. And then scene 2, chapter 2. Jonah from within the fish. It's kind of like the very opposite of chapter 1, scene 1. Jonah running away from the Lord, depressed, upset, asleep, and going down. He goes down to Joppa. He goes down in the hull of the ship and then is thrown down into the sea. And then it's sort of like the ascent of Jonah as he's saved by the fish, and he begins to wake up and cry out to God, and God saves him, and he's happy and he's rejoicing, and it's a psalm of praise. I mean, who writes a psalm in a fish? Really? I mean, who's ever been in a fish and survived? The whole point is it's narrated in such a way that Jonah's down and depressed and disobedient and deserves judgment, and then he's saved and rescued and happy and rejoicing, and concludes the first 2 scenes by going, God, you're the Lord of salvation. You're the God who saves. You're the God who rescues. You're the Lord of salvation. That's how it ends. And then Jonah is saved literally by being deposited, or as the text says, vomited out onto the water. And then we get to scene 3. All of this again is building to chapter 4. But then we get to scene 3, which we're looking at this evening. Scene 3. Jonah eventually goes to Nineveh. And the start of scene 3 is supposed to echo the start of the book, the start of scene 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to Nineveh, and he goes to Nineveh. Now, does he go begrudgingly? Or does he go happily? We're not told. Again, the author is leaving that information out deliberately, because we're going to find out in the final scene, the final chapter. We're just left guessing, particularly if you're reading it for the first time. Jonah goes to Nineveh, and then the Ninevites have this massive revival. And the author, again, isn't just telling us that the Ninevites got converted. He's narrating the story in such a way to build to chapter 4. He's leaving out information to make a point, as well as putting in. It's told in such a way to make a big point in chapter 3 that will serve as a kind of platform for chapter 4. So my question to you, is, what does the author want us to see in chapter 3 and scene 3 that's going to serve his ultimate purpose and climactic ending in chapter 4? What's going through the author's mind in the way he narrates it? Now, some of you look intelligent, and maybe you've worked it out. A few of you might look a bit blank-faced. What is the author trying to do in the story? Don't answer it, but see if you can figure it out in your head. What's the kind of overall emphasis of the story? Well, it becomes obvious when you think about it. And here's the main thing I want to show you. The absolute ease and swiftness and fullness of the Ninevites' conversion. The absolute ease and swiftness and fullness of the Ninevites' conversion. And he does this in five ways. Number one, the simplicity of Jonah's message. Jonah doesn't have to give this long-winded sermon or series of talks, lectures. He just gives what appears to be a very short, simple sermon. You can see it there in verse 4. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. 40 more days and Nineveh. It's got to be one of the most simplest sermons in all of history, doesn't it? Oh, how some of you must long for me to preach like that. Now, to be fair, surely Jonah didn't just say only that. In fact, it was probably a kind of, that's the essence of what he said. When some of you go away to a conference and then you return and someone who wasn't there, you say, what did the speaker speak on? Like some of us went to Revive to hear Don Carson speak. And you come back and you say, well, Don Carson spoke on eternity and how eternity changes everything. Now, is that what Don Carson said? No. But that's the essence of his talks. Now, it could be just that, the essence of his talks. But there does seem to be more in the story that indicates that it wasn't just that. I don't have it on the screen, but look at verse 6. Oh, yes, I do. Sorry, I haven't lit it up like I have that in verse 4 there. But look on the screen or in your laps at verse 6. In verse 6, the narrator describes the message as a warning, a message of judgment. So it seems that the essence wasn't about grace or love or forgiveness or explaining the whole Old Testament story up until that point, Moses, or going as far back as Abraham. There's no mention of that. It does seem to be a message of a warning, a message of judgment. And look at verse 9. The king says, who knows, God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. It's almost as though he doesn't know that God's going to relent. He's just saying, who knows, maybe he will, maybe he won't. I haven't heard that from the lips of Jonah. It seems to indicate. And verse 10, we're told by the narrator, when God saw that they did what they did and how they turned from their evil ways and relented, he did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. How did he threaten destruction? It was through Jonah. So what I'm trying to say to you is the message was simply one of doom and gloom almost. It was this simple message, and yet look how easily they were converted. They didn't hear a long speech, it seems. It just seems a short message of judgment. So there are clues within the text that it was a simple message, and they still converted. Number 2, the immediacy of their conversion. It seems like they were on the edge of conversion, which has sort of surprised everyone in Jonah's day. They convert immediately. We're told that it takes a 3 days journey to go through the city. 3 days. Now, historians, archaeologists have rightly had a bit of a question mark over this part of the story. In fact, you might read about how people don't believe in the book of Jonah as a historical document, not only because of the fish, but because of this verse. Because archaeologists have uncovered ancient Nineveh in modern day Iraq, where ISIS now have a holdover, unfortunately. But archaeologists say it's not nearly big enough for a man to walk 3 days' journey. The text is wrong here. So others have come up with an answer and said, oh, okay, well, Nineveh means kind of not just the city itself, but the region of Nineveh. But I think in the text here, the point is that it took 3 days of preaching. In order to reach the entire city, you would need to go to each marketplace, each area, each street corner, 3 days to reach the city with the message. And the author is bending over backwards to say it took 3 days, but Jonah just took one. As though these guys, they heard the message and then it just spread throughout the city on its own. It's almost as though the author is saying Jonah didn't even finish his message. He just got halfway through the talk, a third of the way through the talk, in a sense, and the city is converted. 3 days journey, but immediately they get converted. They believe straight away. Then next. The Ninevites believed God straight away, almost directly after he's proclaimed in the first day. Thirdly, the extent of their conversion. It's not like a few people get converted in Nineveh. Everyone does. They all do. They all get converted. The Ninevites believed God, a fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, just so we don't miss it, from the people who are way down on the ladder of society, the lowest of the classes, from them to the highest of all, the king. It reached the king of Nineveh, perhaps Assyria, the king of Assyria. Everyone gets converted. Again, he's bending over backwards to say the extent, the ease, how quickly they all came to faith. From the greatest to the least, all of them, it reached the king. And then he repeats it again, I think, down here. Everyone. Let everyone, there's the decree of the king, let everyone, the whole nation, call urgently on God. So you can see the author, in a way, is trying to get us to say, wow, this was a massive nationwide revival. The fourth way, the author is trying to get us to see the ease of the conversion of the Ninevites is the sincerity of their conversion. They didn't go, okay, well, we're kind of interested, Jonah, we'll go away and think about it and come back. Come back and tell us more. They were completely and utterly, sincerely converted. It wasn't like, oh, we'll think about this a bit, or, yeah, we're kind of interested. They were completely, sincerely converted. So they believed God. They didn't get just interested in God, they believed God. And look at this, a fast was proclaimed amongst the people, even before it reaches the king. And then the king, in his decree, says, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks, taste anything. Don't let them eat or drink. A fast. Now, what was fasting about? Fasting in the ancient world was to reflect, to abstain from food and reflect and pray, or in this case, mourn over your situation. And why did they fast? Why did they abstain from food and drink? Well, certainly in the ancient world, food and drink was very time consuming. They didn't have refrigerators and microwave ovens and, fast food joints like we have. They didn't have that at all. There was a long time in preparing food, catching, skinning things, getting wood for fires and all sorts of things. It took forever. If you fasted, suddenly you had so many more hours in the day and you could spend time reflecting and, in this case, mourning over your sin, your rebellion. But also, being hungry sharpened the senses. It gave you a greater kind of awareness of your own sin. And why are the animals involved? Why do the animals have to abstain and have sackcloth and so on them? Well, this was so you didn't have to feed your animal. You didn't have to prepare food for the animal. Go and find the animals and herd them up for feeding. It saved you a lot of time. Everyone in the land was to know. That's how sincere it was. And you notice this put on sackcloth. The king covered himself with sackcloth. Let the people and the animals be covered with sackcloth. This was a way of expressing mourning, much the way we do at funerals when we wear black. Let's put on black. Sackcloth represented death and sorrow and being mournful. And why the animals as well? Well, we've kept that tradition with funerals, haven't we? Certainly in years gone by and centuries gone by, the horses that would draw a funeral carriage were black, covered in black. And that makes its way into hearses. Our cars are black. Let everything be covered in black, or sackcloth in this case. To mourn, we're sorry. There's genuine, sincere conversion going on. And look at verse 8. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways. Their evil ways, I don't have it lit up here. Let them give up their evil ways, their violence. They recognise that they're sinful. And then the king sitting down in the dust. He moves from his throne to the dust. A throne was where you would sit, usually at the end of a war, to represent rest, to represent control, to represent happiness, to represent joy in the city. The king can rest. His rule is complete. But the king moves from his throne and goes and sits in the dirt to say everything is not well in the city. And fifthly, the divine confirmation of their conversion. Just to make the point, the author is telling us that God himself has given their conversion a stamp of authority. So in the last verse, in verse 10, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. When God saw what they did and how they turned, that they repented, that they turned, that they were sorry, that they were remorseful, God didn't judge them, saves them from that judgment. So there are the 5 things. How the author is trying to get us to see the ease and how easily it was for these Ninevites to be converted. The simplicity of Jonah's message, the immediacy of their conversion, the extent everyone gets converted from the lowest to the least, the king himself gets converted. They were sincere about it. They see their mourning, what they do. And then fifthly, a divine confirmation of their conversion from God. Okay, what does this mean then? What are the applications and lessons for us in this? Well, let me give you 4. 3 minor ones and 1 major one. Here's some lessons. Number one, God can use the simplest message. Here's God using a simple message to convert people. God can use the simplest message. That ought to be very encouraging for you if you're genuinely interested in reaching anyone with the gospel. Suddenly you realise, I don't have to go and do 3 years of theology to then be a proclaimer of the gospel. God can use the simplest little, sometimes 1 or 2 sentences. I've told you this story before, but for those of you who haven't heard it, it really goes well here. And then I had a friend, I still have a friend, this lovely lady who brought a neighbour of hers to church to hear the Christian message. A non-Christian neighbour, someone who didn't go to church, she brought him to church. She brought him this particular Sunday, knowing that there was going to be this impressive speaker who was very, very good and who was going to be sharing the whole message of Christianity. She thought she'll bring this man along, this neighbour along, to hear, and maybe he might get converted. She brings this neighbour along, and she realised she's got the week wrong. It's not this man at all. In fact, it's another guy who doesn't normally preach, but she'd heard him once or twice before, and he was pretty bad. She's thinking, oh no, of all the weeks. And what made matters worse is this man was preaching through a genealogy in Genesis. A genealogy where it says, so-and-so lived this many years, he had this son and these kids and so on, and then he died. And then so-and-so begat so-and-so, and then he had this many kids and so-and-so, and then he died, and so on and so on and so on. She thought, oh no, and the guy got up and preached very unconvincingly, she thought. She almost said sorry, but she didn't. She was just glad he came. He went home. And then that service, that whole event led to his conversion. Why? He said he went home and he couldn't get the words, and then he died, out of his mind. He thought, I'm going to die. I've never really thought about my own death. And just that one little line led to his conversion. Your one little simple message. Maybe it won't be 40 more days and Putney will be overturned, or London. But your one little message can get under the skin of someone. And just quickly, when I was first going out into the workforce and I was playing in a band, when we weren't touring Australia, I was working in a pub in Sydney, Australia. And 18, 19 years old, I'd have my Bible on the bar and people would chat about my faith, and I was a little nervous about it, and I tried to not get it too in the face of people. And I remember having a chat about my faith with a barmaid who was working with me. And I just asked her one question. I remember distinctly asking her one question. And this is the only real conversation about my faith I had with her. And I said, if you died tonight and you stood before God, and God said to you, why should I let you into my kingdom? What would you say? I said to her, if you died tonight and you stood before God and God said to you, why should I let you into my kingdom? What would be your response? She said, oh, I don't know, or maybe I've been good enough, or she was really puzzled by it. And that was the end of the conversation. 5 years later, about then, I was touring the band in New Zealand. And we were playing and speaking in a big church there. Hundreds of people. And after the concert, she came up. Total non-Christian. Well, I thought she was. I said, what are you doing here? She said, I became a Christian a few years ago. How did that happen? And she said, I was so angry with you that night when you asked me that question, but I couldn't get it out of my head. And I went away and I wanted to know what I would say if I died and stood before God. That led to her conversion. I didn't even know. And for me, it was just one question, one sentence. God can use the simplest message, and here he does in this case, and he can with us. Secondly, God can use any speaker. You don't have to be a polished speaker. You don't have to know all this sort of stuff. If God can use a reluctant, runaway, sinful, racist, self-righteous prophet like Jonah, he can use you. Don't feel that, look, some of you have been Christians only for a short time. God can still use you. Simple message and an unpolished speaker. Even if you're going through doubts, God can still use you to reach people of Putney and of London. Thirdly, anyone, anywhere can be converted, may repent. Don't think that anyone is beyond the realms, the reach of God. Anyone can be converted. People in Afghanistan, people in Syria, people in Iraq, people in China, people in North Korea can get converted. Anyone can get converted. A greedy banker, an obnoxious neighbour, a painful relative, a lazy student, a rude work colleague, a horrible boss, a violent football hooligan, a racist Nazi, a stubborn atheist, a Buddhist, a Muslim, a drug dealer, a human trafficker, a nice person, a kind person, a mum at the school gate, a dad down at the pub, people in Putney. If these wicked, horrible, violent Ninevites, these Assyrians, as Luke reminded us last week, these Assyrians where you can go to the British Museum and see how horrible they were in Jonah's day, holding heads up of their victims, impaling people on sticks like an early form of crucifixion. If they can get converted, then anyone can, and Putney people can. But last of all, and here is the main lesson of the chapter, and the one that serves chapter 4, the whole book, most of all. This is teaching us how God saves. It's teaching us about His grace and the importance of repentance and faith. There's nothing in the chapter really about how the Ninevites then started being good and kind and laid down their weapons and started doing things that you'd normally associate with Old Testament laws. Do you notice there's nothing about the covenant? Nothing about circumcision? There's nothing about the 10 Commandments? There's nothing about them speaking about Moses or anything like that. There's none of that. It's like the author has deliberately left out anything that might hint at them being good. It's all about them being sorry. All about them being remorseful. All about them just believing and repenting. That's the point. The point is that they're not saved because of their goodness. The whole point of chapter 3 is they're saved all on the basis of God's grace, and all they're doing is believing God and saying sorry. That's the point of this chapter. And when they do that, they're all saved, they're all rescued. They all believed, they all repent, therefore they are all saved. That's the point of the chapter. It'll be the point that Jonah wrestles with, not to give too much away, in chapter 4. That they simply forgave without, they simply were forgiven, at that instance. That's the point. They didn't have to work it. They didn't have to keep the covenant. And it wasn't years later after being good that God finally went, okay, you guys, I think you're good enough now. You've climbed the moral ladder. I'm going to allow you in. The whole point of the chapter is to show us how God rescues, how God saves. And this, folks, is something we all still need to hear. All of us need to hear this. You might think this is Theology 101 then. I know I'm saved by grace. But in the back of our minds, all of us still have a works mentality. I've got to be good enough to earn God's forgiveness. I've got to be good enough to get forgiven. I've got to be good enough to make it into heaven. It's all about my moral performance. Or that I've just done good things, or I'm part of a good bunch of people. I've got Christian parents. I have a Bible on my shelf, along with some John Stott books, Tim Keller books, therefore I am saved. No, it's nothing to do with that. It's all of God's grace. And what you do, nothing. It was nothing to do with good, being good. It's all to do with just believing God and saying sorry. I must, and that leads us finally to the cross. All of this is pointing us to how God worked through Christ on that cross that first Easter. It was all about Him paying the penalty. It's all about Him dying that first Easter. And Him absorbing the penalty that we deserve and that we can't work our way. And it ties nicely with that question I asked that barmaid. If you died tonight and God said, why should I let you into my kingdom? What would you say? The only right and proper response is say, I believe that Jesus died for me. I believe that He rose again. I believe in you, Lord, and the story of the Bible, the good news of the Bible. And I'm sorry for what I've done. But as soon as you stand before God and you say, well, I should be allowed into heaven because I've been good. I've given to charity. I've paid my taxes. I've been kind. I'm a good person. Then it's all about you being morally good. And no one is ultimately good enough to get in on their own strength. It's all down to repentance and faith. That's how God works. That's how God saves. That's what this chapter is teaching us. And it'll be what Jonah really hates and wrestles with in chapter 4 as we begin to look at that next week. Let's pray.